Okay, so first of all, welcome everyone. I think it's about our time to get started with our Faculty Research Forum. So first of all, it's a great pleasure to have you all here. My name is Felipe Campante. I'm a professor here at SAIS and also currently the Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs. And I think this is a great initiative, the Faculty Research Forum, that we have implemented over recent years that really allows us to, I think, see by ourselves a lot of the richness and the wealth of research that we have here at SAIS. And I think today's speaker illustrates this in a very succinct and perfect way. So we're going to have Jonas Nahm, who is Assistant Professor of Energy Resources and Environment here at SAIS. And Jonas, I think, really kind of illustrates this cross-cutting sort of intellectual endeavor that we have here across disciplinary fields, and with sort of this backdrop of a tremendous policy relevance. So his research interests focus on the intersection of economic and industrial policy, energy policy, environmental politics, so all topics that are very much in the order of the day. And as we were just discussing here before we started, this is a book about climate change at some level and sort of the policy challenges of climate change. But it's a book about, I think, where that policy debate has come to be, and it's particularly relevant right now, where we've moved, I think, from the point where we're kind of trying to maybe convince people that climate change was important and like, okay, we need to reach certain goals and so on, to the point of actual implementation of a lot of these things. And once you start thinking about that implementation, you see a lot of these challenges, right? How you actually do this in practice, right? And Jonas's book, Collaborative Advantage, Forging Green Industries in the New Global Economy, is precisely trying to draw lessons from comparing these different cases, China, Germany, and the United States, to really shed light on that question, right? How is it that in practice we get these new sectors to work, right? Particularly given that like different countries are in different positions along the spectrum, what can policy do about it? So I think it's a really topical research, issue, and that's something that Jonas has been working on for quite a long time. And this book has been recognized as the crucial contribution to this debate that it is. So it was awarded the Don K. Price Award by the American Political Science Association, in particular the section on science, technology, and environmental politics, as the best book on science, technology, and politics published in the past 3 years. So kind of showing some of the recognition that Jonas has been able to garner. And to be our discussant in this afternoon here, we have the pleasure of welcoming another of our very best, Professor Matthias Matthijs, who is Associate Professor of International Political Economy, and whose research kind of focusing on political economy topics such as economic crisis and regional integration and so on, which I think actually marries quite well with what Jonas is going to be talking about as we're kind of trying to grapple with how these different countries and where they fit in the sort of international order and how that affects their policy making. So without much further ado, I'm going to invite Jonas to come up here and lead our discussion. So let's welcome Jonas here to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you for such a kind introduction. We've had to postpone this event several times, and I'm glad we did, because we could finally, we postponed it for long enough that we can now do this in person, and I think it was worth the wait to get together here today. Thanks for sort of continuing this research forum, Felipe, and thanks for agreeing to discuss the book, Matthias. He promised he read the whole thing this summer at some point, so this is also a test of whether that's actually the case. And before I started, I should also thank sort of the Hopkins library system, which actually gave me a grant to make the book open access. So whatever parts of this that you're still interested in after I'm done speaking, if you go to the Oxford University Press website, there's a little link that says open access, and you can just click on it and the PDF will download immediately, which I think was a really nice sort of gesture and kind of support from the library system. So my plan is to talk briefly about the broader outcome that I'm explaining in this book, and then sort of present the argument that I'm making, and then I'll go through 2 of the 3 cases just out of interest in time, China and Germany, which I think are sort of really nice cases to set up a discussion about the US, maybe in the Q&A. And as Felipe said, this is a book really about building clean energy industries, so the industries that make all sorts of things that we need to address the climate crisis. But it's a more general book really about industrial policy in an age of globalization, and more recently, sort of what's left of globalization and to what extent industrial policy can be effective in that new world. And so, in that sense, I'm very grateful to the Biden administration for passing the Inflation Reduction Act this summer, which has made this book sort of relevant in a whole new way a couple of months after it was published. The Inflation Reduction Act, which you all know, is not really primarily about inflation. It's really about sort of the ambitious opening in a new industrial policy gambit in the United States. It's really about starting a process of catch-up development, if you will, in which the US is trying to kind of catch up with China and to some extent Europe in building these kinds of clean energy industries that we've long promised to build domestically but never really have succeeded on. And so in that sense, I think it's an industrial policy bill, and it's precisely the kind of policy that this book talks about. And so the book is not so much about whether the US will be successful in that case, but it is a book about why the US ended up with a piece of this global division of labor that it has been not very satisfied with for a long time, and has had very complicated domestic politics around climate change as a result of this. And so the US has been wrestling with this for a long time. Why did these sort of strength in American research and development funding and these amazing American research and development institutions not translate into equally strong capabilities in making these kinds of technologies domestically, as they did for a long time, particularly sort of in the immediate post-war decades. And so the answer to that question, as many questions these days and many answers to questions, sort of begins in China. But the story I want to tell today is not a story of sort of China undercutting everyone with subsidies and unfair kind of industrial policy advantages. And so when I started working on this project, it really started as a China project and as a project of trying to understand why China was so rapidly dominating these new industries, wind and solar, that were becoming more and more critical to combating the climate crisis. Back then, many moons ago, under the Obama administration, Obama had just declared the clean energy race against China as something the US needed to win. So this sort of idea of a race was very prevalent from the beginning, and it seemed that China was winning at the time. So Lindra, which many of you are too young to remember probably, was this sort of famous solar company that was propped up by the US government, which went bankrupt in a spectacular failure and took with it $500 million in taxpayer money. So there was lots of frustration in the US about the race and the US position in that race. In Germany, too, some high-profile solar manufacturers had gone out of business in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And they raised broader concerns in Germany about whether Germany, with these strict labor laws, these old vocational training institutions, a sort of dated financial sector, could be competitive in a global economy against industrial giants like China. So could this high-wage manufacturing model actually survive? And when I started visiting China, and I spent years kind of touring factory compounds like the one on this picture here, I was surprised that this wasn't really about a race at all. I mean, I really sort of went into that project with that idea. I was surprised to find a lot of collaboration between German, American, and Chinese firms in trying to kind of bring these new technologies together and bring them to market collectively. And so China's firms were very competitive. They had incredible economies of scale, focused on the types of innovation and R&D that you need to bring these new technologies to market. But they were doing so on production equipment that was bought in Germany and made by German firms, and many of the technologies were invented in the US, and the materials and components that they were using also came from America. So this was very much a sort of collaborative story. An example, for instance, was JA Solar, which is a Shanghai manufacturer of solar panels that had, at the time, released a new type of high-efficiency solar cell. But sort of a key ink, this sort of silicon ink that they were using in that production process, had been developed in collaboration with a US startup, and the cells were then made on German production equipment in this Chinese solar park. And so It turned out that China's industrial parks, and I apologize, I didn't realize the screen would be so small, but point if you need to see something on these graphs that might be a little bit too small to read. It turned out that China's industrial parks were not really the beachheads in a clean energy race, but they were really more centers of global collaboration in a division of labor that spanned many countries, 3 of which I talk about in this particular book. And so within that division of labor, firms from each different economy had picked a very distinct and in some ways complementary set of skills. The Germans were bringing focus on sort of manufacturing equipment, machine tools, sort of high-end production stuff that was produced at very low volumes. Chinese firms were contributing what I call innovative manufacturing skills in this book. So R&D really focused on manufacturing, how to scale manufacturing faster and make it cheaper. And American firms were incredibly, and still are incredibly good at inventing new things, but didn't really have a lot of capabilities in bringing those new things then to the market. And so that kind of division of labor was surprising for a number of ways. For once, it was surprising because governments in all 3 economies were actually trying to build domestic industries that were in some ways independent from other countries. And I think part of that was the sort of political logic in these industries. If you spend a lot of public money on subsidizing markets for clean energy technologies, it's much easier to pass these policies if you also promise local manufacturing jobs, for instance, right? And so that logic sort of prevailed in all 3 places. But despite that, we ended up with these very different industrial specializations, even though, as I sort of outline in a chapter in the book, each country kind of used very similar policy tools to try to attract these domestic industries. So we had similar industrial policy frameworks in each economy, but then very different responses from firms. And so what started as these open-ended explorations of sort of what could be in the future in the early 90s by 2000s was really an industrial policy framework, but that yielded very different industrial policy responses, I guess, from firms in each economy. The development of these very distinct national political economies around wind and solar was also surprising because these were really the first post-globalization industries. And so I'm not going to make this a very methodological talk about case selection and all that sort of stuff, but one of the reasons why I think wind and solar were exciting, because there weren't that many industries at the time that had really developed after China had joined the WTO, after sort of the reorganization of the global economy in the 1990s. And so even in those new industries that really had very little in common with the pre-globalization world, there was no, legacy solar manufacturing in the American Rust Belt in the early 2000s. Even though we sort of started from scratch, we ended up with industrial specializations that in many ways reflected what these countries had been strong at for a very long time. And so firms kind of replicated these distinct strengths in these new industries. And they did so in ways that was both interdependent, in many ways complementary. So skills from each of these locations were required to bring these new technologies to market. And so here I'm just sort of mapping the participation of some firms in the development of some of the kind of key technologies that really advanced these industries. But the broader point is that there was a lot of collaboration in these industrial parks in China, and China in many ways was sort of the place where this all came together. And so the central question that I'm asking in the book and that I want to discuss with you today is why firms pick these distinct industrial specializations in defiance of government policy and goals, and sort of in defiance of these ambitions of policymakers that from the beginning very much promised domestic manufacturing jobs in return for public investments in clean energy markets. And the answer that I give in the book is that globalization itself enabled this sort of persistent and consequential divergence of these national industrial specializations and the kinds of institutions that support it. And so what I argue is that globalization didn't just make us all the same. There was a big political science literature that worried about that when I was in graduate school. What I argue instead is that it created all these opportunities for differentiation, and that that differentiation kind of came true both in terms of what firms specialized in different places, but also in terms of the kinds of national political economies that they then supported and maintained, the kinds of institutions at the national level. And I'll get a little more concrete later in the talk to outline that. Before I dive into that, though, I think we need to talk for 1 minute about what I really mean by globalization. I think I'm going to upset both the political scientists and the economists probably in the room, so this is a really wise move. But if I can sort of simplify this, I think there's one view of globalization that has really seen it as a process of reaping gains from trade based on a notion of comparative advantage. And so globalization from this perspective can really be seen as a sort of process of progressive outsourcing. And that in many ways was the concern of the Obama administration, right? So would firms just outsource more and more of their work to China to the point where even the core kind of American strength and innovation would be undermined because there would be nothing left to produce here, sort of the results of that R&D. The political science side of things kind of worried more about the consequences of the competition in that system, right? So globalization is often seen as a process of convergence that sort of pushes countries to adopt the same kind of regulatory frameworks and economic institutions. And so the question there was, is it even possible to sort of keep distinct national systems alive in that global economy? Could German firms at the time compete against Chinese competition despite high wages, despite sort of a pretty rigid labor market system and a financial sector that couldn't really muster up the kinds of investment that firms were getting in China? And so the view that I kind of, that ties through the book, that I've weaved in there through these chapters, is really a book based on the fieldwork that I did and talking to people on the shop floor in these factories for years and years. And it's a view that's really, so they're not based so much on kind of an academic literature, but more on this fieldwork experience, one that views globalization primarily as a set of new opportunities for collaborating across borders, for firms to find specialized skills in other firms that allows them, to do things differently and to specialize themselves. So an opportunity to specialize, collaborate, and engage in a division of labor. And so if globalization is in part about collaboration, and I'm not pitching these three views as mutually exclusive, just as sort of different perspectives on the same process, I use this word collaborative advantage throughout the book, not just because it's a catchy title, but also because I think it's shorthand for a kind of process that these firms that I interviewed went through as they inserted themselves into these new global industries. And so what I argue in the book is that firms derived really two sets of advantages from participating in the global economy in response to these kinds of government policies that they got domestically. So first, because of these new opportunities for collaboration, they could participate in these industries through specialization. So they didn't have to do everything. They didn't have to know how to make production equipment, polysilicon to go into these modules, make the modules, and then make the kind of core technologies as well. But instead, they could pick one of those different niche specializations and participate and find other firms that could do other things to actually get the stuff to market. And so in that sense, collaboration really obviated the need to establish all the skills required to kind of invent, commercialize, produce, and market a new technology domestically. I think that's very different from, say, the Ford car manufacturers in the 20th century that owned everything down to the rubber plant that would make the tires. And then the second sort of advantage that I outline is that collaboration then enables specialization, and that in turn allows firms to pick very distinct pathways into these new sectors and pathways that are compatible with the kinds of domestic institutions they already have at home. And so in entering wind and solar sectors, German firms could do so with the kinds of technical skills that would benefit from the institutions that were already in place in Germany, and they could repurpose and adapt these institutions for these new economic sectors. This is the most political sciencey part of the conversation, so rest assured it'll get a lot more concrete. And so basically the argument that I make is that by allowing firms to specialize and to build on these existing skills and institutions, globalization itself enabled them to create and maintain these distinct political economies, that division of labor between sort of the German specialization, the Chinese specialization, and the American specialization in these sectors. And so one quick example would be, for instance, this German company that I always love to bring up that was a kind of an auto supplier in the 70s that entered then the solar industry by building sort of existing automation knowledge. It added new skills from the medical industry, dental drillings, where the drill is a laser that goes through like a sort of beam of water to cool it at the same time. They figured out how to use that to drill through solar panels in ways that they wouldn't break. And so then they worked with the Chinese partner to actually develop manufacturing equipment that used that technology, and then are now, I recently went back and they're now making engines for electric vehicles using some of the similar sort of core technologies. And what they were able to do this because they had these domestic institutions, but also they had the Chinese partners to help get the stuff to market and create demand for these things, and parts of the materials that they were using were coming from the US. And so instead of kind of undermining these traditional economic institutions that many at the time really thought were kind of threatened by developments in the global economy, these firms were able to reinvest and strengthen these domestic institutions and to become part of the kind of political lobby behind them, whether that's Germany's institutions for small and medium-sized firms, or kind of China's infrastructure for manufacturing, or perhaps the US institutions for research and development that we can talk about in the Q&A. And so it's quite the opposite of a race, actually. It's because of globalization and the collaboration that it enabled that these traditional industrial specializations and the kind of economic institutions that support them survived in these new sectors. And it was because of such collaboration that across national borders that wind and solar became these mature technologies. So let me just briefly illustrate this with kind of two short stories from Germany and China, and then we can kind of have a broader discussion about where we are today. This is kind of changing by the minute. It's a good reason not to write a book about industries that are not fully mature, because you sort of keep getting emails back from the editor that you have to update things. But so I'll talk about Germany and China. I'm happy to talk about the American case. I think that's maybe the most dynamic one, which is why it's difficult to put on slides, but it's perfect for Q&A. And so let's start in Germany and this kind of specialization and customization. German firms focused on machine tools and production equipment. There was very few manufacturers actually of solar panels or whole wind turbines in the German case. It renewed these traditional specializations from machine tool industries and so on in these new sectors. This was high-wage manufacturing, very, very sort of highly skilled, and this was happening in the context of a sort of broad recession in the early 2000s that really kind of collectively called the German model into question for a long time. And so what you see in that case, and I realize this is hard to read for people in the back, but basically the gist of this graph is just to say that German SMEs focused on the sort of machine tools and production equipment, high technology component part of these industries. And they did that by building on and repurposing institutions of the sort of traditional German economy. They did that by working with collaborative R&D institutions for these small and medium-sized firms. They did that by getting financing from credit unions that sort of seemed like from a different time. And they did that by building on the existing vocational training system that survived in the German system. Germany had very similar industrial policies to China and the US, actually. It sort of combined both subsidies for R&D, essentially, and subsidies for market on the other side. The German law was then directly copied by China, sort of when China started subsidizing these things. So it wasn't very different in terms of the kind of industrial policy tools that were used there. But the kinds of firms that responded to this in Germany were firms that focused on customizations, a very distinct set of firms rooted very in kind of the old core of the German economy. And so when I did a count at some point in 2013, when the industry was sort of peaking, the vast majority of firms and the vast majority of employment in the German economy was really in these component suppliers and not actually in the production of solar panels. One example would be the Schmidt Group, which was founded in the 1800s as a foundry. It then started making saws for lumber mills, got into manufacturing equipment for furniture. Then they started making printers for electronic circuit boards at some point, got into the solar industry, then found a Chinese partner, got really good at making solar production equipment, won a bunch of awards for their efficiency. So this is sort of a reinvention of the same firm over and over again in these different industries. But as I said, they couldn't do it alone. The Chinese firms complemented the skills of these German manufacturers. They provided incentives to actually develop very targeted manufacturing equipment for these new industries. China was also sort of the first economy to apply this production equipment at scale. So contrary to what you hear in American media, China was the first country to automate these technologies or the production of these technologies because labor turnover was so high that they couldn't keep up with training. And so in the early 2000s, solar manufacturing in China became automated at a time when in the US and Germany it was still kind of being bolted together manually. And so what happened is that the German manufacturers drove a big export surplus, actually, for wind and solar sectors in these industries with China. And they did so by relying on these very traditional resources for manufacturing in the German economy, the vocational training system that has a lot of trained apprentices, and a sort of financing system that had these old relationships with house banks and this kind of credit union system that was not able to lend a lot of money, but was able to give patient capital that would allow them to work on these kind of transformations for a long time. And this revival of these German firms is really impossible to think about without the role of China. China was kind of a key partner for Germany in this, and we can talk about where that leaves Germany today, as both Russia and China are sort of slipping away as partners for this kind of collaboration. But what happened in China is a different kind of specialization, this sort of specialization of manufacturing, in manufacturing R&D, at a time when the central government in Beijing really pushed innovation and actually wanted to move beyond manufacturing for a long time. Firms instead specialized in the kind of manufacturing R&D, and they did so by building on a kind of infrastructure for manufacturing that was really built by local governments in China, often in defiance of central government goals. And again, I can talk about that in much more detail, what the kind of fiscal incentives for the, see Andy nodding in the back, there's a whole literature on this, we won't have to go into that now. But essentially, local governments were really keen on manufacturing, the center was really keen on innovation, the firms sort of used the local manufacturing economy to focus on some innovation in manufacturing instead. And so they did that. They focused on upgrading, on pulling away from manufacturing at the center. Becoming technologically independent was a major goal of these industrial policies that they in some ways copied from other parts of the world. But what we got instead was essentially R&D teams that looked at how to make these technologies faster and cheaper to produce, not by cutting corners, but by changing the design essentially so that you can that they're more easily manufactured, for instance. And so that kind of innovative manufacturing yielded some results. Today, China makes something like 97% of the world's solar wafers, makes 75% of batteries. It also makes more than half of the world's wind turbines and wind turbine components, so it took on a very kind of dominant role in the manufacturing. When you talk to people why that happened, in a lot of these early interviews, people were sort of saying, like, we could buy technology from other parts of the world. That wasn't the problem. People were willing to license things. What nobody had really figured out was how to make the stuff at scale. This is the early 2000s. If you drive from Los Angeles to Palm Springs, you see this sort of sea of wind turbines on the side of the highway. You also see a lot of them kind of burned out, like this sort of wreckage lying out there. This was not an industry that was very mature. There was lots of faults. No one had really figured out how to make this at scale. There was no off-the-shelf production equipment. Chinese firms were sort of like, why are we replicating the skills of other countries? What no one has figured out is how to make this stuff reliably at scale and to sell it for a cheap price. And so that's sort of what happened in the Chinese context. But they didn't do that alone again, right? So the flip side of the German collaboration with China is that instead of kind of following these indigenous innovation guidelines, they continue to work with technology partners in other parts of the world, both on the production equipment, but also on the components. And so Goldwind is one of the sort of famous early Chinese wind turbine companies. They never really got rid of their German partners. They got R&D funding to become technological independent every year. And the Chinese government sort of tolerated the fact that there was a German partner in the mix the whole time, as long as there was a Chinese brand printed on the box that shipped out at the end of this process. So there's some flexibility here too, but it was definitely a collaboration. And they also did that by repurposing manufacturing institutions at the local level. And I think the key here really is a financial sector, state development banks in China that were willing to lend to manufacturing expansion in these new industries at a time when no one else was willing to do that. I think there's a lot of media coverage of whether those loans were at below market interest rates, whether they had to be repaid, whether they were unfair or not. But I think the real, in some ways, this is sort of distracting noise, because the real innovation was that there was a financial system that was willing to lend to wind and solar industries at a time when American venture capital was more interested in funding Tinder. The Germans didn't have any money, so they could give you $2 million to retool your little machine tool factory, but they couldn't give you $2 billion to build a new plant. And so the real innovation, I think, that China brought to the table institutionally was this financial system that was lending to these firms, often brokered by local governments and backed sort of as local government loan guarantees. And so even after the 2008-2009 financial crisis, Chinese firms were able to expand their lending and invest in more production capacity at a time when financing for these industries dried up in many other parts of the world. And what you got instead, or as a result of this, were kind of very drastic cost declines that now all of a sudden make it such that wind and solar in many parts of the world are the cheapest source of energy. And so if you've been reading the news on Ukraine with kind of European gas prices being driven up, it's now that wind and solar are making windfall profits because gas is sort of setting the electricity market price in a lot of European countries, and wind and solar are way below that. But even before this sort of increase in the cost of fossil fuels, these new technologies were much cheaper than many of their fossil competitors at this point. So where does this leave us? I'm conscious of time, so I want to kind of wrap this up. What I've argued basically, and hopefully convinced at least some of you, is that globalization itself and sort of the opportunities for working together enabled this development of this division of labor, a division of labor that in many cases or in many ways built on these traditional strengths. I think the US case is the one that has the most investment in R&D and probably the least to show for industrially, but in the German and the Chinese case, it worked out quite well. And so these legacy institutions that at the time many thought were kind of going extinct in the global economy were kept alive by new firms investing in them and kind of bringing them into new economic sectors. Since I sent the book to the publisher, the world has changed a little bit. One of our colleagues, Henry Farrell, has written smart things about this. And so, you know, in the 2000s, there was a long debate about how to protect domestic political economies from globalization. Sort of, can France still be France in the global economy? I feel like 10 years of my life was reading this stuff in grad school and undergrad. And it now turns out that it might be globalization itself that requires some sort of savings, right? So in the last 2 years, we kind of radically flipped the perspective here. I think there are tensions with China now everywhere that call these supply chains into questions. And I think the Ukraine war also has really changed the calculus on a lot of stuff. So there's a new focus on self-sufficiency in a lot of countries. You could call it mercantilism maybe in some ways and in some places. And it's a crisis for economies such as the German one that have really relied on this kind of collaboration to keep these traditional sectors alive. And so in that context, to sort of close back where we started with the Inflation Reduction Act, it's really very ambitious as a policy move to try to change the American position in this division of labor. I'm happy to sort of take your views on this. I'm a bit skeptical that it'll work, or at least work in the time frame that the administration foresees, because the IRA itself only gives demand-side incentives. It gives incentives for people to buy cars that are made in the United States, solar panels that are made in the United States. But if the book is right, which I still think it is, the institutions that actually enable firms to do this sort of stuff are really important, and the IRA itself does nothing to change these institutions, and politically we probably won't have a chance to touch these things for another 10 years. And so there's nothing in there in terms of financing for manufacturing, really. There's no new institutions for vocational training. So there's not really an investment in different kinds of ecosystem. There's a demand for different kinds of technologies, but not much to help firms actually meet it. And so I'd say Collaborative Advantage predicts that this will be really hard to pull away from the rest of the world in these sectors, at least in the next 10 years, which is all that matters on climate, right? We'll have to have fixed this problem by then. And so that's hard because China now is so dominant in these industries. I think I've sort of honed in on that a few times. I think the actual percentages, I should have updated the slides, are probably much higher now even than they were then. But these climate industries benefited enormously from globalization because they were coming of age during globalization. And so pulling away from that is not going to replace these supply chains as quickly as I think many hope. And so looking at the battery industry, for instance, you see that China is rapidly expanding its share of global manufacturing of electric vehicle batteries. The US sliver there in blue is getting a little bigger, but not anywhere compared to rivaling like Chinese dominance of these sectors. And China is now building in these new industries on exactly the same mix of institutions that made it big in solar and in wind. And so what do we do about this kind of politically? And I think I applaud the Biden administration for trying to change the American position. I think politically that's very smart. I think it's really difficult to pass climate policy without also showing some domestic industrial results. But I think we don't need to pick one or the other, at least not immediately. We can try to do both, right? Let's buy things from abroad while also trying to build things domestically. It's not a zero-sum game in that sense. And so I think that would help our relationship with China to sort of take some of the tension out of this. But I think it would also mean that we could, at least in the short term, meet our climate obligations while also trying to kind of build long-term alternatives to this division of labor that in many ways is becoming very difficult to sustain politically. And so I will leave it there and hand over to Matthias, who has read the book. Thank you, guys.
Thanks again, Jonas. Thanks, Felipe, for the invitation. The publication of a new book of a colleague is always moment for reflection, but also of celebration, right? So congratulations. It's a wonderful book. Actually, for our PhD students present here, this is probably, I imagine this comes out of your dissertation that you wrote back in the day at MIT and worked on at Brown University during your postdoc before you came to SAIS. But this is, as far as structure go for a good dissertation, it's ambitious in the sense that it has an introduction and conclusion, but it also has 2 theoretical chapters, and I'll talk a bit about this, right? And normally there's one theory and then multiple cases. This has significant theoretical and also empirical contributions. So it almost reads like a novel. I read it on a domestic flight in August to Denver and back, and I think there's just enough time I needed. I read the whole theory part on the way there and all the chapters back, and I reread the conclusion yesterday to prepare for this. And I did have a hard time putting it down. I am a comparative political economist by training, and it speaks directly to this literature, and I was getting ready to teach comparative political economy again this fall, so it gave me a lot to think about. So I want to tell everybody here, first and foremost, right, while this is, of course, global warming, climate change loom in the background, this is not a book about the climate crisis per se. It tells us what is being done about it, and it gives us a huge reason to be optimistic about the future. But to me, this book really is a kind of superb piece of political economy scholarship and how to do it well. So let me do 3 things in the 10-15 minutes that Dean Campante here has allocated me here today. I'll discuss the book's, what I think that the main theoretical insights are, chapters 2 and 3. Then the book's main empirical insights, even though Jonas has covered quite a good bit. And then I'll end with a few questions to get our discussion going as we open it up to the audience. So, as I started reading this, I was like, wow, I should have really read this book 10 years ago, right? Because as I was kind of getting ready to kind of revise my syllabi in comparative politics and comparative political economy, there was no book quite like this, right? This book really makes you rethink some very basic insights from the rich political economy literature on globalization from the 90s and the 2000s, right? anybody, and my students here know this, right? There's constant calls to integrate the comparative part of political economy and the international part of political economy, but nobody really does it, or does it well. I mean, there are efforts on the IPE side to include more domestic politics, and on the comparative side to include international influences, but nobody really does it as well as Jonas Nahm does in this book. So remember, and the main expectation in the 1990s that political science borrowed from the economics literature was that there was going to be broad convergence on the American model, right? This kind of race to the bottom idea that taxes would be cut, regulation would be down, and of course, early 2000s, Peter Hall and David Soskis came out with Varieties of Capitalism saying, well, actually, no, like there's ideal types, right? There's a liberal market economy like the United States, and they have these institutional advantages, but there's coordinated market economies like Germany, their ideal type, that can do equally well and that could thrive in this new world. And more recently, there's been growing research programs on growth models, right? So as Varieties of Capitalism focused on the supply side and what pushed growth from a supply firm side point of view, recently political economists have focused heavily on the demand side, right? Where does growth come from? And that has given us, kind of demand-driven or domestic consumption-led driven models, investment-driven models, or export-led models. And so we've seen this literature go from contributions like Anke Hassel and Pallier, and of course recently by Baccaro, Blythe, and Pontussen, in which Jonas has a very good chapter in that landmark volume on green growth models, which is also worth reading. Actually, that has enough, I was thinking as I read that chapter, that's enough for your next book, because that's a very different research agenda. So Jonas has two main theoretical contributions in this book. So as opposed to this whole idea of varieties of capitalism, Jonas presents an argument on varieties on innovation, if you want, to be found in the three main players in wind and solar renewable energy production: Germany, US, China, which to some extent are the result of its own legacy domestic institutions. So in that sense, the US, your typical liberal market economy, has used its global leadership in research and development to focus on innovation when it comes to green industries. Germany, your typical coordinated market economy with strong vocational training institutions, its own state finance nexus, government support for industry, and weak availability of venture capital, has focused on customization within those industries. And then China, I guess a typical example of state-led capitalism, focused on mass manufacturing of wind and solar, but far beyond your typical low-cost production, right, which most people would kind of intuitively think of, and this is what Jonas calls innovative manufacturing, right? So these three already, rather than thinking these very typically domestic ways of states trying to structure their economies, already tell you, well, they had very different paths into renewable energy. But the second main insight, beyond the varieties of innovation, and this is a national story, right? And this still very much fits into this kind of domestic-led growth model things, is, and that's the title of the book, is the idea of collaborative advantage, right? So these purely national strategies in the rapid development of renewable energy technologies have failed in that sense, right? They all tried very similar things, these three countries, the United States, Germany, and China, in trying to develop these new industries. And so it has occurred through highly integrated global divisions of labor across the sector, with no country being the location of entire industrial processes from invention through to employment. And this despite the fact that all three countries developed very similar policies and strategies to promote wind and solar, but actually ended up with very different outcomes. So I think that's just a very healthy reminder, right, to a science audience, to our students especially, that, don't do this kind of partial equilibrium analysis, because it only gives you part of the story, right? I mean, industries cheering the fall of the pound in the UK would do well to realize how much they're importing from the rest of the world before they start cheering how much market share they're going to gain. So Jonas shows these firms, and that's what the main theoretical contribution is about. They can do this on a cooperative basis. For example, German firms that develop new parts to wind turbines can do so collaboratively with the Chinese firms that deploy them in mass manufacturing contexts, but whose innovations in manufacturing then enable them to adjust these products and license the adaptations back to the German firms to improve them even further. A second example is there's tremendous back and forth between American and German firms when it comes to innovation and the customization of this, right? And so that, I think, is, for when I was reading this, when you study political economy at the national level, that's something you don't always think about, right? And so there is a kind of very comprehensive approach to how these industries have developed. Also, I mean, for those of you who don't know much about solar and wind technologies, it is kind of striking to me as I read this is how different they are, right? These two industries. How solar is basically, if I remember it reading correctly, 5 or 6 stages. And this can actually probably develop relatively easily in a domestic context, but for wind energy, it's a very different story. I mean, there's thousands of parts. It's an incredibly complicated supply chain, right? So it's not something you will start doing yourself completely independently tomorrow. So that leads me to the main empirical insights to this book. And I think that's probably the most remarkable, right? I was talking about this book to some colleagues in the kind of European-focused comparative political economy, and I mentioned the book, and I was like, listen, what is amazing about this guy is he does 3 countries, and he does them well, right? So most people know one country really well. Then there's people who know 2 countries in one region really well. But there's very few political scientists who know 3 countries in 3 different continents, right? Speak the languages, Chinese, German, English, but also know and has a kind of in-depth knowledge of this. So that's unique about, I guess, about this book and about our colleague, Jonas Nahm, that he is an expert on the political economy of Germany, the United States, and China, right? You can find Germany and the US. You can find the US and China, but you can't find all 3. I think it's incredibly unique. And so this is bound to get people's attention in this CPE literature, which is traditionally Europe-focused, the China studies community, and of course scholars studying US politics and political economy. Main insight in chapter 4 on Germany is that Germany's industrial legacies led it to specialize in customization in wind and solar industries, as well as repurpose its long-standing institutions for collaborative research, house banks, and vocational training. And Jonas really shows quite persuasively how Germany's famed Mittelstand, right, the kind of the small and medium-sized enterprises, the backbone of the German political economy, if you want, got a completely new lease on life in renewable energy, right? Conventional wisdom would have small firms would have a hard time competing against Chinese firms. However, it's precisely because their engagement with China that they were able to survive. The main insight in chapter 5 on China is that of China as a scale-up nation. We are long beyond the labor-intensive, low-value added and low-wage manufacturing of the 1990s. Since 2006, China is all about the promotion of indigenous innovation. And I know Andy Murtha's here; he knows this, and but most people who kind of study other parts of the world probably don't, especially people who focus on advanced industrial countries. He shows how this innovative manufacturing is at work in China, as well as how it interacts and fits within global supply chains, with the Chinese government encouraging huge investments in the sector that has allowed it to flourish. And the main insight in chapter 6 on the United States is one of innovation without production. And what's interesting about this is that, the lament you hear within the U.S. context about the U.S. lagging behind, right, and losing the race in solar and wind and alternative energies and so on. And I mean, the real story is that a lot of this stuff was invented in the United States, right? It's like it may not be produced here, but without American innovation, we wouldn't be where we are today. And so inventing without production required finding global partners, which they did in Germany and China, and repurposing the institutions for technological transfer, venture capital, and R&D, right? The things that varieties of capitalism literature tells us the U.S. is so good at. So the US clearly is one of the leaders of the world's transition towards clean energy, even though it lags in productive capacity. So in sum, the main insight is that it will be very hard to go it alone in renewables, right? I think that's kind of what you ended on, because one, it'll be hugely costly, and two, it'll take a very long time to get there, which leads me to my main questions to you, Jonas, and then I guess we can open it up for discussion. So, first of all, and I think that's probably the most common feedback or criticism or question that you get. I mean, it's a great story, this book, right? I mean, it makes you feel warm. It makes you feel hopeful and optimistic about the future. And after all, you're in a public policy school. That's a message you wanna give to students, right? Is that you can do things, right? But we are at size, right? Where there is talk of decoupling between the US and China, or even between democracies and authoritarian regimes. In other words, politics, right? Politics constantly interferes with this. Ask the Europeans how happy they are about the content requirements and the rules of origins written into the Inflation Reduction Act, which benefits Mexico and Canada, but not, of course, the EU and the UK. I mean, the moment the IRA was released, right, you could actually hear, at size, you could hear the collective gasps in the EU delegation on K Street saying, "Oh no, Canada and Mexico, why not us?" Right? I mean, we should be benefiting from all this U.S. largesse. So, which then again led many Europeans to say, "Okay, we cannot rely on the United States for this. We need to develop our own capacity on the whole supply chain and so on." So my first question to you, and you've answered it to some extent at the end. So maybe you can go into a little bit more depth after I give the floor back to you, is how will a continued quest on the part of the US to decouple from China, on the part of the EU in search of open strategic autonomy, as they call it so nicely, and on the part of China to become actually much more self-sufficient and switch from their kind of export-led growth model to a much more domestic demand-led growth, how does this impact your story, right? So if you were to update this in, let's say 5 years, and your editor says, "Can you give me a new introduction and a new conclusion?" Right? Would it become more conditional, your story? And then my second question is, how is the current global energy crisis changing the quest for renewables? Right? So one would think that this is the perfect moment to speed up the transition, but it's also costly. And it's hard politically, and every country has its own idiosyncrasies, right? Think of France that still relies for 80% on nuclear energy and so on. So I was wondering, maybe in the interest of, I think, our audience as well, maybe you can comment on what your story teaches us for other emerging markets, right? The countries you didn't talk about. So think of emerging markets in Latin America, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. How can they either tap into these global supply chains, right, and benefit from the collaborative advantages that you describe, or how can they speed up their own transitions to renewables, right? Or is there actually a darker side to this current crisis that may well lead us all back to coal or something like this? Anyway, let me end right there. Thanks again, as they say, to give me the opportunity to read this book. It was a real pleasure. I cannot recommend it highly enough, including to my own students. And look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
So your first question on decoupling, I mean, it's a hard one, right? Like, I think these attempts are essentially undercutting what made these industries cheap. And so anything we're doing to sort of cut this off will make it more expensive. It's not a new attempt to do this. The US has had trade remedies on Chinese solar panels since 2012, 2013. It hasn't really brought solar manufacturing back to the US. It's forced Chinese suppliers to relocate to Malaysia and Vietnam, and it's made solar panels more expensive in the US. So it's not really sort of fundamentally shifted the division of labor in the way that folks intended. I think that so that's sort of the sad part of the story. I think the positive part of the story is that we're going to have to expand these industries so dramatically that there should be a lot of space for other countries to enter these sectors without necessarily having these distributional battles with China, right? There's about I think 900 gigawatts of solar installed today globally. I think we need to install that every single year until 2035 in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So we have a little bit of work to do, and if the US wants to make some panels, and if Europe wants to make some panels, see my very high-tech book holder there, then you can imagine that there's lots of room for other places to get into the game. My main concern sort of from this research is that we're shutting out opportunities before we've really developed viable alternatives. And that might be fine in any other sector, but we're not talking about any other sector. We have to peak global emissions in the next couple of years. And so, even delaying things by 3 or 4 years because we need to build up domestic supply chains will make meeting these goals so much harder. And I think that's sort of where the climate implication of this is. And so, so I think the pie is growing. There should be space for everyone. I think in the short term, we would be wise to try to figure out what the slices are, who can expand their part without already kind of giving up on the division that's already there. And I think that links to the question about emerging markets and what they should do. I'm working on a project right now with Joanna Lewis at Georgetown, who works on wind mostly in China. And we've been mapping out global supply chains for a number of these industries to look at where could these technologies scale if we decided not to buy from China anymore. And it's really interesting if you think about sort of who participates. China usually is like between 60 and 90% of the supply. And then we're mapping out who are the runner-ups, right? Sort of who has some of this pie that could expand. And all of the African economies and a lot of the Latin American economies are participating in this solely through extractive industries, right? So it's like lithium mining, it's all the shit that nobody else wants to do, essentially. And so if that's the new division of labor and that's the role we assign the developing world in this growing industry, I think we're going to have a host of other problems, right? So I think there are lots of things, lots of places can do. The question is sort of what kind of institutional help do they need? What can USAID do? What can the State Department? I mean, we need to kind of mobilize, I think, to make sure that we're not replicating this sort of very extractive division of labor in these sectors now as we scale. And it also means that we probably have to do some of the dirty work domestically. I think the Biden administration is trying to do that through local content requirements, but we'll see how that lands in California when we try to do lithium mining in the suburbs of Palm Springs, right? So I think there's a lot of battle still to be had. I think I'm overall very optimistic about it because I think these economic opportunities are really going to be very helpful. But I think we need to be careful to not replicate kind of an economic system that hasn't really served developing countries that well in the past. I'll go by seniority. So Jim, you go first, and then Felipe next.
I'll go the other way. I will go last.
No, go ahead.
So just to follow up on that, can you hear me? I can't tell how loud this is. So this is a great book, obviously, and fantastic. And thank you for sharing it with us. In the short run, obviously, these cultural, historical, institutional factors are reasonably fixed, right? But presumably they're not immutable. I mean, if this is a Heckscher-Ohlin model, it's not like land is a fixed asset, right? So turning it on its head, right, which is that if you wanted to change the culture, right, if it became important that you either wanted to become autarkic or that you only wanted to partner with other democracies, are there strategies that you could learn from the other institutions and structures rather than the kind of industrial policies that we're seeing now, which are insensitive to the insights that you have, that actually could be a kind of more enlightened version of it that would produce institutional change that would allow either Germany or the United States or others to capture these different elements of the now diversified strategies?
I mean, I think that's exactly kind of my takeaway. I think I would make this a two-part answer. One, if we want to get good at manufacturing, we should probably try to figure out why China is so good at manufacturing rather than just saying they did it all because it's unfair government support, right? So the first step is kind of to be open to institutional lessons that you might learn from other places. And then the second part is exactly implementing those lessons and trying to figure out what institutions are missing. I don't think the US is bad at manufacturing because of some sort of cultural history of, I mean, everyone tinkers with their lawnmower. This is a country of people who like to build things, right? So I think that's not the reason. The reason that we don't have good manufacturing in this country is because we have great institutions that fund universities. They then fund startups. And then those startups suddenly need $2 billion to build a manufacturing plant, and there's no one willing to fund that because they gave the money to Facebook. And I think that's sort of where we need to start thinking about what could we do. And I think the Inflation Reduction Act is doing some of that sort of within the constraints of what the executive office can do, what can be done as part of a reconciliation bill, so you can only really do the budget things, and so there's all these loan guarantee authority measures for the Department of Energy in there, so they can now, offer some loans to manufacturing plants. But I think what be needed more broadly is a kind of an American development bank, essentially, something that European countries have that is tasked with providing financing for sectors that are underserved by existing financial institutions. There were a bunch of senators on the Democratic side that floated something this summer called the Industrial Finance Corporation. It died in reconciliation at some point, but that would have been essentially $50 billion going in to capitalize a bank that then can make loans, makes money on some interest they charge, and that would go towards manufacturing investments in strategic industries and sort of, perpetuate itself over time. And I think those are the kinds of institutions that we can build. So there is this whole varieties, I think Matthias alluded to that. Sort of theoretically, there is this varieties of capitalism literature that basically says, okay, you have these interlocking institutions domestically and firms are completely constrained by them and we can't break out of them because they're all so like self-reinforcing. And I think that's wrong, right? I think institutions survive because they are providing utility to firms, and also we can create new institutions that will take off if they are solving a need that the private sector has been looking to solve. And I think, for instance, in vocational training, we can do that. We can do that with financing. And so there's a lot of opportunity for sort of this cross-country learning in terms of what kinds of institutions we can build. The problem is they're a lot harder to build than to kind of pass an executive order in this political environment that doesn't really, provide for these sort of sweeping reforms that we would all like to see, on both sides of the political spectrum here, really. Always like scared to ask an economist to ask a question. It's always like a big ask to ask for them to wait until the end of the presentation, and then I feel like it all breaks.
I was kind of trying to keep my hand. So I'm thinking about this. Thinking about this as an economist, I mean, there's one way to interpret this, which is sort of the Heckscher-Lin way. So those of you who are doing the drinking game with Heckscher-Lin, it's starting to get interesting. But it would be like, okay, you have these endowments, right? Which I agree with Jim. They're not fixed, but they are endowments, right, in terms of institutions and so on. But I think there's a second lens here from economics, which would be coming from like growth theories, sort of endogenous growth theories, I would call it, right? Because the role of scale here is crucial, right? The reason why you have these German firms innovating is because they have the prospect of scale offered by their Chinese partners, right? Now, so I think that highlights a danger of the decoupling mindset, because that that sort of kills the incentive to innovate, right? So it's not just a matter of like losing gains from trade kind of in a static sense, but there's this dynamic component which in this industry is particularly crucial because you need innovation. So I wonder like how you would think about that in terms of like your policy arguments. Maybe am I off here, but that's what this got me thinking basically.
So you mean the scale is the scale on the Chinese side? If you start breaking this up, you lose.
Yeah, what I mean is the fact that you have a big market to sell to, right, means that the fixed cost of coming up with an innovation, you can dilute that fixed cost through like a big market, right? So that means that you have more of an incentive to innovate, because if you strike gold with an innovation, you can sell it to billions of people and not to millions of people, right? So that is a sense in which that drives the incentive to innovate in a way that I think brings these dynamic gains that you would lose if you were to succeed actually in sort of trying to break this into these different. So I think that's a crucial dimension there.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason why the U.S. has also historically done so poorly in these sectors. And I mean, not only are the institutions missing, but the way that we've supported these markets domestically has been so volatile and so fraught politically that I think for folks looking to invest in these sectors, they've been very concerned about bringing these kinds of brick and mortar fixed assets to the US that you can't use for anything else. So it's not just decoupling, kind of breaking this up, but it's also other parts of the world not being quite equally reliant in doing this, right? And so the key kind of US policy tools that we've used are tax credits for wind and solar energy production. They go back to the 1970s, essentially. They have been expired, renewed, let lapse so many times, and you can see the sort of order books of wind manufacturers where it's this like boom and bust cycle, right? Like the Senate's voting on the last possible minute, everyone's trying to get their order, and I mean, it's a very inefficient way of working it, and if you can have any of that production somewhere else in the world where you can also serve other customers, you're not going to bring it here. And so I'm hoping, and I think there is a sort of move in the same bill to try to provide a more stable framework for markets domestically that might solve some of that, but I think you're right, it's breaking it up. The other thing that there's sort of a big debate is because China has achieved these incredible scale economies, these existing technologies are so cheap now that there are next generation technologies that could sort of theoretically be even better, that are coming out of American labs, and they can't break into the market because it's just impossible to compete with the stuff that's already there. And so there are these interesting dynamics emerging, for instance, around thin film solar cells that could be incredibly cheap and easy to print on anything, really. But because China is so good at making these kind of, at this point, traditional technologies, it's very difficult for this new stuff that the US is very good at to break into this space. And so these scale economies in China are also sort of disrupting this flow of innovation in other parts of the world. I don't know a good solution to that, but I can, there's always rumblings in DC about what to do about the sort of lock-in effect because of Chinese scale economies. Why don't we start here and then we take, Okay, do you want to help me field questions? We'll take both, and then.
Go ahead.
Great. This is a political and institutional question, but I'm curious if you can speak to how the forces in a German and/or Chinese context gained enough momentum to shift towards these higher efficient, greener industries, when I know that there wasn't an inherent climate need driving those forces, and how they overcame the fight against nascent industries or less efficient but existing German or Chinese companies that might not have gone the way of efficient or green without a burning climate crisis in the background.
Do you want
to? Thank you so much for this great talk. I have a question related to, kind of the monopolization of China monopolizing all these industries. Is there a worry that if, and a big if obviously, but if something were to happen in, say, Taiwan, that we could see China weaponizing these industries, kind of similar to what Russia have been doing with oil and gas?
These are both good questions. So on the first question, sort of how did you get there without being kind of hijacked by the fossil fuel lobby? How did this even happen? There's different pathways for different industries, but I think the overarching answer is that no one really saw this coming in the sort of time dimension and in the cost reductions that then happened. And so I think initially these industries were being funded sort of as cute little projects that might eventually help us do things a little bit differently. I don't think anyone in the late 1990s and early 2000s really saw this as a technology that would basically undermine the American utility business model, and with it every teacher and public pension fund that's heavily invested in utilities in the country. So there's this huge disruptive force now, but I don't think anyone saw that coming. In China in particular, there were sort of two dynamics. The wind industry was really very early kind of an experiment on part of the central government to see if they couldn't diversify to new sources of energy. China became the world's biggest oil importer in the mid-1990s, so it doesn't have a lot of resources, and sort of was trying to figure out what are some of the security implications of this. The solar industry was almost solely funded by local governments, really sort of without any center involvement at all. Until about 2009, and until 2009, something like 80 or 90% of solar panels in China were manufactured for export, coming out of your average industrial development zone with some support by local governments. And then Spain scrapped its solar subsidies in the wake of the financial crisis. A lot of the other European countries really paused it. And the central government was sitting there now with this huge industry that all of a sudden didn't have any markets to support anymore. And so they basically have been sort of fixing the mistakes or chasing sort of the local government action. And so Chinese policy essentially became what it is in the solar space because the center was worried about social unrest and unemployment, and also banks just having lent an enormous amount of money to these industries that then didn't have any markets anymore. And so in 2009, during the financial crisis, China passed its first domestic solar legislation to really subsidize a domestic market. So I wouldn't call that a strategic foray. I mean, it was kind of chaos at the subnational level, lots of different governments supporting their local manufacturer, and then all of a sudden that system sort of threatening to collapse, and the center had to step in. In terms of weaponizing interdependence, Henry isn't here, so I can say whatever I want, I guess. But I think that's exactly the concern of a lot of European countries. There was this moment this summer on Twitter where I feel like everyone started lecturing me on the fact that there are rare earths and critical minerals in these technologies. And it's sort of everyone had this collective, I don't know which article it was, maybe Foreign Affairs printed something, but there was this one moment where everyone was just but you do know there's rare earths in these things. And so I think there is a new sensitivity towards these security dimensions that are not so obvious if you just look at the final assembly of these products, right? So dig into the supply chain and you find that it's not where the lithium is coming from, it's where it's being refined. China basically owns all of the global lithium refining capacity, and so you can't really circumvent it. And so you do have these kinds of bottlenecks in these industries. And so I think there's a lot more attention being paid to that, and the IRA in some ways is also a response to try to fix this in the long run, because it has very specific local content requirements, not just for the final battery, but also for all the raw materials that go into it, where the refining of these raw materials occurs, and perhaps tellingly, free trade countries with which we have a free trade agreement are exempt from a lot of those requirements. And so the US sort of politically is now dividing up the world into kind of little dubious, definitely dubious, and these are our friends, and trying to reorganize these supply chains to prevent that kind of thing. I think the interdependence thing is overblown to the extent that we've always modeled energy independence or interdependence on the oil crisis of the 1970s. These solar panels won't stop working tomorrow because we have a bad relationship with China. Whatever's already here is going to keep working for however long it was meant to work, right? And so I think the shock isn't going to be as immediate as it would be, but there are concerns about being able to meet climate goals if, we don't have access to sufficient raw materials to build the stuff, for instance. I mean, I don't know. There's all these rumors about, we couldn't buy Chinese subway cars for the DC Metro because apparently they were worried they'd be spying on members of Congress taking the subway to work and all of that stuff. So I think you can push that kind of idea as far as you want to push it. But I think, yes, I think we have some security from these kinds of immediate effects. We're not relying on oil tankers coming from Saudi every day to keep the lights on, right? Andy.
If I shout, will people hear me okay? We're recording. Thanks. Sorry about that. So first of all, I just want to congratulate Jonas on a wonderful presentation, and I also want to congratulate Matthias on a wonderful set of comments. That was really world class from both of you. So I just wanted to start with that. I also I want to distinguish myself from Matthias in that I have not read the book. So please keep these two questions with that in mind. The first, I think, is part of the conversation that's going on right now. That about kind of the flip side of factor endowments, and I guess it would be along the lines of, if you tell a very kind of optimistic story. Let's say there's a kind of a pessimistic chain of events, turn of events that we may or may not see fairly soon. Out of the three countries that you studied, what would each of their vulnerabilities be to some sort of a decoupling, and which one of them might be kind of most affected negatively by that? That's the first question. The second question is, I had some questions about your use of institutions when talking about kind of the local growth story in China, because the ones that you pointed to, at least in the talk, are development banks, and those are to a non-insignificant degree driven by kind of local governments, and so you don't see too many institutions getting in the way, but rather a set of priorities. Invest here, invest there, invest there. And I guess so one question there is about institutions, and then the second one is, in your research, did you find things like the relatively quick or the relatively short tenures of these local officials? Did that in any way, shape, or form affect this, the story that you tell, or did that exist largely kind of outside of it, or independent of it? Thanks.
Oh, these are tough questions. So in terms of the decoupling, I think that's probably the harder one. I think the risks are very different, right? I think it looked like China was winning this for a long time, but it may end up winning this game. But I think it also made a pretty risky bet in order to get there, right? These are huge investments in kind of fixed assets in manufacturing equipment and plants in industries for export production that weren't guaranteed. I mean, we didn't know how this was going to play out. We also didn't know if other countries would catch on and actually sort of create markets domestically and then let Chinese technologies come in. And so, I mean, if anyone got stuck with that amount of production capacity and couldn't use any of it for export anymore, I think it'd be very difficult. I think China can kind of ramp up domestic markets to some degree, but you can't, I think its production capacity now for polysilicon is literally the size of the global installation of solar PV, so they can make as much silicon a year to make as many solar panels as are installed in the world right now collectively, right? So that is a risky bet, and this decoupling could sort of make them sit on a lot of idle capacity, and there'd be some local governments that go bust and banks that go bust, and that sort of story as well. I think the Germans are vulnerable in a whole different way because they really rely on I mean, at least for now, these are industrial products that often require large amounts of energy. Some of it can't be electricity, and so they're sort of caught between. They bet on like two players that are now turning out to be like unfaithful friends, right? And so, using Russian energy to sell things to China in the current situation doesn't sound like a winning strategy for maintaining sort of a high standard of living. Where I think that Germany is well equipped, though, is that these example of these firms sort of reinventing themselves so many times is a story of institutions that support that kind of redevelopment. And so I think it's a very precarious situation, but it's also one that comes with some kind of way out. Like they'll figure out some way of sort of doing the next thing. I have a lot of faith in that part. But yes, I think that's a very different vulnerability. I think in the US, the vulnerability for the longest time was political. I think that the US is the largest investor in R&D in renewable energy technologies going back to the 1970s. It dwarfs what any other country has spent on the development of these technologies. And then it didn't have anything to show for it, right? it has installation and maintenance workers that are not well collected politically, that are not unionized, so that doesn't sort of carry the same political weight. And I think there's a kind of symbolism around manufacturing work in this country that we associate with 1950s double garages, union jobs, single, one income families. And so I think that has a lot of appeal, sort of this idea of saying we have the production here. And I think the US really for the longest time spent a lot of money to support this public good globally and couldn't show so much for it domestically, which I think is a big factor in the volatility of the policy landscape here. And so I think that's a different kind of, it's a vulnerability really for climate policy here rather than for particular industries. So I wouldn't want to have to pick who I am here in this trifecta, but I think they all have a lot of homework to do now in the current situation. And in some ways, the IRA is the result of some of that homework, right? I think there's actually constructive policy now trying to kind of fix this. In terms of the local institutions, so the development banks were huge, and I think it wasn't just that they were local. I think the central development banks also often lent with local government backing, right? So local governments arranged the loans and then also sort of offered to pay for them in case the firm couldn't repay them. And so they were kind of a critical kind of lubricant in that flow of money from the center. And so I kind of count them as local institutions, even if the money technically is coming from a central bank, because it was the local municipality that negotiated the deal. And the 10 years were, I think the 10 years were important, but I think it wasn't just the 10 years. I think that the general pressure in the Chinese system to show GDP growth in very short periods of time basically cuts against the kind of innovation that the US is good at, right? Like you can't go to local government and say, okay, so you have to show every year or at least every 3 years what you've done, but why don't we invest in fusion technology and see if this is a good bet, right? Like everyone's going to be like, okay, this may or may not work out, but in any case, I'll be retired by the time it does, so there's no benefit for me. And so I think there's a bias into investing in manufacturing because the pure investment in the plant, the construction work itself is already counted in the GDP. And so there is a sort of focus on that. What I found in a lot of cases that I thought was interesting were conditionalities built into these subsidy arrangements for land or tax breaks or something like that, that required firms to produce a certain amount of X by a certain date. And so this kind of scale didn't just come from the firms wanting to achieve scale, it was actually kind of a condition on getting the support from the government. And so I think that definitely has to do with the sort of timing that's built into the Chinese system that doesn't leave a lot of time for anyone to yeah. You had your hand up for a long time.
Okay. Could you contrast the whole term of comparative advantage with your collaborative advantage?
Yeah, I mean this is the difficulty of presenting this book when economists are in the room. I think I have an easier time with this title in political science, where people I think are not as caught up. But I do think that there is I think it's sort of trying to emphasize a different element of it, and I think that's still true. I think this idea that you don't replicate what you can buy in these global supply chains. I think a lot of firms were like, well, even the American ones. So Innovalite is sort of a great story that was brought up by, they developed the silicon ink that you can use for LED screens, but it also had this application in solar. Sort of a very core technology came out of a national lab in the US. They got money to sort of figure out if this could work. They wanted to become a manufacturer, and in the US, there was no one willing to give them any money to actually manufacture this stuff. And so investing these billions of dollars in trying to be a solar manufacturer would seem sort of a bad idea. But in collaborating with a Chinese firm that already had the manufacturing capacity, they then became a very successful Silicon Valley sort of startup that was then bought up by DuPont Chemical, and they started selling this stuff to everyone in the world. And so I think that's a different story of sort of realizing your competitive advantage through collaboration, right? Like you could only get there because you had inputs that didn't come from the domestic system, and so I think that's how I would contrast the two, and I think that's a good way to end this event. Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
So much. So thank you so much all for coming. We could spend an extra hour or two here discussing this. So we have to stop at some point. So thank you very much, and hope you can make it to the next one. You're going to hear about it. It's going to be in October. Hal Brand is going to present it, but you're going to hear the details. So we're going to be talking
More China.
Yeah. So it will be. It's in the air. Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.